Coming up on Chopper's political podcast, I remember having armed police in my house, in my constituency at 3 o'clock in the morning because I had risk to life that was immediately against me and there had to be provisions put in place.
Welcome back to Chopper's Political Podcast. Happy New Year. Thank you for joining us again in 2025. I bring you weekly the best guests, gossip and stories from the heart of our studio here in Westminster. It's been a not so quiet Christmas break though, because Parliament's back, and as MPs return from their constituencies, one topic has dominated the front pages and airwaves for days now: the rape gangs scandal. This is not a new topic, as we've heard from different voices raising it over the years. But today on Chopper's Political Podcast, I want to ask one question. Why is it taking so long for politicians to wake up to this rape gangs scandal? I'll be speaking later to Conservative MP for Keighley and Ilkley, Robbie Moore, who has raised the issue 40 times since he became an MP back in 2019 in the House of Commons. But first, we're speaking to our investigative reporter, Charlie Peters. Charlie Peters, thank you for joining us today on Chopper's Political Podcast. Where are you?
I'm in Rotherham now, in the town centre, Chopper. I've been here for the last couple of days as part of a nationwide tour on this issue. We started in Tameside and Greater Manchester, where there's never been an independent investigation into this scandal. And we moved on to Oldham and indeed Rochdale, where there have been some local reports, but lots of people think that they were insufficient.
But Charlie, why do you think that these issues have been ignored for so long in Westminster? There's been a few individuals like Andrew Norfolk at the Times, yourself at GB News and others who have raised it intermittently, but broadly it hasn't really landed in terms of international consciousness in the way it should do until now.
Well, Chopper, fundamentally there has been a conspiracy of murmuring over this issue for so many years, in part because of the racial element, the fact that the gangs are predominantly Pakistani heritage and the victims are predominantly white girls. There are many other reports also of Sikh girls being targeted, and also these gangs targeting Pakistani girls and boys as well within the investigations we've seen. But fundamentally, people haven't been able to own up to that fact. Another major part of the concern is that so much of this abuse, and we've found reports of it happening in some 50 different towns, have happened in local areas where the council do not want to investigate for fear of cover-ups being exposed, we believe, but also the risk it may pose to local voters from those communities that would be investigated more heavily than others. That's my theory as to why this has been covered up for so long. And the one town where we've had most investigation, where I am right now in Rotherham, a Casey review by Dame Louise Casey in 2015 did find explicitly that Labour politicians in this town attempted to cover up the issue and chilled investigation and conversation on that problem. With that vote in Parliament last night, I think lots of Labour politicians around the country feared that thorough and aggressive investigations would find the same problem in their constituencies.
But Charlie, Baroness Jay, Alexis Jay, she said her report in 2022 needs to be implemented first. There's 20 recommendations there. 4 of them are on the way to being implemented. 16 not yet. There's no deadline for that. Why have another inquiry now?
Well, I'm not surprised that Baroness Jay says that because, of course, her report comes in for a lot of criticism from campaigners on this issue and survivors, it's key to say. Many of them have told me, and we've been saying this for the last few years, that it's a sham because it only looks at a handful of areas with on-street grooming, just 6 areas, including Warwickshire and St Helens, but none of the northern mill towns where this abuse has been so rife, including the town that Baroness Jay came to in 2014 for that major report. And when it comes to the main section from the ICSA inquiry, across 400 pages, Rotherham is mentioned once, Rochdale once, and that's in relation to Cyril Smith, the Lib Dem MP. Telford, another town that's had a local review, does not get a mention at all. So lots of survivors say it's not a sufficient investigation into the specific problems of group localised child sexual abuse and exploitation. Yesterday in Parliament, the Reform MP Nigel Farage said that the ICSA report was something of a shotgun. What he was requesting through that inquiry was a rifle shot, an aggressive review specifically into that GLCSE, which we haven't had. We found, as I've said, reports of this happening over 50 different towns, but so far I've yet to hear a defence that says that the 6 areas looked at was sufficient and that the subsection of a sub-report into ICSA covered the issue sufficiently as well. One more thing on this as well, Chopper, because we're talking about those 20 recommendations. Not a single one of those recommendations is specific to grooming gangs, okay? One of them is about having a minister for children. The government, I think, they've said they won't be adopting that, so that's 19 left for them to go through.
But part of the difficulty maybe with why people prefer not to talk about it, and that has made the problem worse, is talking about it. Do you say Asian rape gangs, Pakistani rape gangs, mainly Muslim Pakistani gangs? What do you say? Because that language is so important, and yet it does single out communities, and it does mean that people think badly of an entire community rather than just those who are doing the dreadful things.
I've always said Pakistani grooming gangs as the predominant but not the total representation, and I try and avoid, and I recommend people avoid using the term Asian, because that drags into communities who often feel as though they're more victimised than a part of the targeting, in particular the Sikh community. Lord Singh of Wimbledon, I've spoken to him about this on several occasions. He really reaffirms that point, that the media, when this scandal first broke, were very happy to use the term Asian because they shied away from the specific issue of Pakistanis, which has taken a bit more bravery from some media houses to use that term specifically. And there are, of course, fears of people being singled out and there being intolerance in reaction to that information. But Chopper, I've always thought this scandal has generated more intolerance through silence than through investigation. People shied away from this problem for so long because the only people speaking about it back in the start of this crisis were the BNP. Nick Griffin's party were campaigning heavily on this issue in the early 2000s, particularly in the northwest communities, in Bolton and in Keighley and areas around the northwest of England. It took the Times newspaper in 2010 and 2011 to start publishing its pieces in Rotherham for this scandal to break. But people didn't learn from that reporting. We didn't have a national conversation about the crisis. People went after Andrew Norfolk. They made his life hell. They called him Islamophobic. Labour MPs who've tried to deal with this issue, they've also had issues. GB News, we've had issues. People have come after my reporting aggressively because of this coverage. But if we stay silent, only the worst voices will speak out on this issue. The truth does not fear investigation. It's up to the journalists and politicians to engage with it.
And just finally, Charlie Peters, it's been pushed into the foreground in Westminster by Elon Musk, the world's richest man. He owns Twitter, X. He's posted dozens of times since New Year. Have you welcomed his interventions? In a sense, they've got everyone talking about it. Or do they distract?
Well, I take what the survivors have said to this, Chopper. They are very grateful, everyone I've spoken to, that we've had, frankly, this global spotlight on this crisis. I think a lot of people in this country just didn't know how bad this problem was before the man with 211 followers on the platform he owns on X started sharing it, and especially after...
Million.
Yeah, 211 million, million followers, sorry. I can't keep up with these numbers these days. But yeah, he went big on it. He went big on it. And he shared our report last Wednesday, that exclusive from Oldham, revealing that the Safeguarding Minister, Jess Phillips, had denied an inquiry, a government-led inquiry there, after a 4-month delay. And that really drew a lot of attention, suddenly to thinking, well, if they're ignoring that and they're taking 4 months to do it, what other inaction is taking place?
And just before you go and report for GB News again, Charlie, how are you feeling? It's been quite a whirlwind for you.
I'll take stock later. For now, there's more stories to cover, there are more voices to put forward, and there are more survivors to hear from in this national scandal.
Well, listen, we'll leave you to it, Charlie Peters. Thank you for joining us today on Chopper's Political Podcast. Back to your work. Now, I'm joined here in the studio at GB News by the Tory MP for Keighley and Ilkley, Robbie Moore. The question we're asking on this podcast, Robbie Moore, is why on earth politicians, not you, have ignored this for so long?
Well, I think it's been incredibly frustrating having campaigned on this issue since getting elected in 2019 to represent Keighley, that it has taken so long for this issue to now be getting so much presence in the national headlines.
You've raised it for 40 times. I mean, 40 times in the House of Commons is a lot of times.
Yes, yeah. And not only that, I've made it one of my core campaigns at a local level, because this is something that has haunted my constituency, and not just my constituency, but many other different towns and cities across the UK, but Keighley, absolutely, and across the wider Bradford district.
What is the issue?
Long.
What is the issue in Keighley and Ilkley for you? How many girls have been affected? Has anyone been jailed? Has there been any investigation?
So there's been convictions, absolutely, and there's been convictions of rape gangs not only operating within the Keighley area but across the Bradford district. But there's not been enough relevant to those historic cases that are still being explored and investigated by West Yorkshire Police. But there are still live cases that are being looked at the moment, and ever since me getting elected, I've not shied away from actually calling this issue out for what it is. It's been a minority of Pakistani Muslim men that have been targeting, predominantly white young children for far too long. And let's not forget this. It was Anne Cryer, who was the
Labour MP,
who was the previous Labour MP for Keighley two decades ago, that first brought national prominence to this absolutely horrific issue.
And how many victims do you know of in Keighley?
Well, I've met with many of them.
How many have you met?
So I've met since being the MP. I think I've met probably just under around 15.
15
of not only the victims but their families. As well, because let's remember this impacts with the wider family as well. And I've also brought the previous Home Secretary up to Keighley, Priti Patel, when she was Home Secretary, to meet with some of those victims and those survivors, so she, as in her role as Home Secretary, could hear directly.
And has there ever been an inquiry into this in Keighley? We're seeing individual inquiries of Rotherham, Oldham, or
no.
wanted in Oldham.
So I've been calling for this since getting elected.
For what?
For a inquiry across the Bradford district.
Not a national one or a local one?
So I've been campaigning very much strongly for a local inquiry across the Bradford district that has been looking at sexual exploitation and gang-related grooming. It's not happened, because I've constantly been asking for a local inquiry and get told at a local level this is a national issue. You then heard the Prime Minister just this week, and our safeguarding minister, saying, well, actually, this should be up to local councils or local authorities or those with local safeguarding responsibility to deal with this. So when you've got a local council like Bradford Council that's refusing the request, and a national government that literally voted yesterday not to back our request for having a national gang rape inquiry, what does that say to the victims and those survivors and those families across Keighley and the wider Bradford district who have been calling on this, as have I, who are now in this situation of not getting what they want?
It's an utter disgrace.
It is a disgrace.
That it's being kicked about. It's a literal political football. It's being kicked about by people who should know better, who are failing these victims. And we heard from Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, under questioning from your leader, Kevin Badenoch, on this. He met with victims and survivors on Wednesday. He said then that victims and survivors are in different places on the issue of a national public inquiry. There's no fixed view, is what he said. And is that the problem, that there's no firm voice for what victims want? Or are the 15 victims you mentioned and their families intent and wanting a national inquiry?
Well, look, I invite the Prime Minister to come up to Keighley, to sit down with those victims, those survivors that I have sat down with, because the consensus, I can tell you absolutely across the Bradford district, is that they want an inquiry. They
don't care if it's national or...
They are not, and likewise, that's the category I fall in. I absolutely just want to shine transparency and have some openness on this issue, which unfortunately the British state, and when I refer to the term British state, I'm meaning national government, local government, anyone with safeguarding responsibilities, for far, far too long has failed those victims. And I felt incredibly frustrated that whilst, yes, it's great to have such a national profile on this, even the responses from the dispatch box, I feel, from the Prime Minister, has been more about the narrative of who said what, when they said it, how much have they talked about it, rather than actually putting at the heart of this issue is those that have been impacted.
It's a Labour failure, I would argue, also a Tory failure. You said there that Priti Patel, as Home Secretary, met the victims, but she didn't call or organise a public inquiry. Why is that?
Well, back in 2022, the ICSA report was published.
Baroness Jay.
Who had worked on this for a number of years, doing a lot of interviews, and produced a very, very substantive, detailed
across a lot
report.
Of strands. One strand was child grooming or rape gangs.
But it also looked at what had gone on in the Catholic Church, what had gone on in care homes. Yeah. So obviously, we've had about 2 years to act on those recommendations. I've always advocated, actually, that we should have acted on those recommendations straight away. Of course, there's a bit of time that you have to digest those recommendations and what you're going to do. But I've always said we should get those recommendations in place. So we've had 2 years since that report's been produced, and not gone far enough. There was the grooming gangs.
haven't been implemented at all. The Tories did not do it.
No, and I'd be the first to say that we've implemented a task force, we've implemented the mandatory reporting, but no, and we should have done. Let's be clear about that.
Mandatory isn't even out there yet. Mandatory, it fell off when the election was called. It fell. It wasn't even passed into law, was it? On mandatory reporting.
No, and therefore, and that's why I'm referring back to the British state. The Labour government have now had 6 months been in power, a quarter of the time that we had when we were in government to respond, and they haven't actually done anything. In fact, really, the Home Secretary only came to the chamber this week because if she hadn't done a statement, we would have forced a UQ.
Monday afternoon.
So, really and truly, again, regardless of political party, and I do not want to make this about Labour versus Conservative or any political party, those in positions of responsibility have not gone far enough in terms of acting on behalf of those
where we are at the
victims.
moment, the government says there has been a national inquiry. It's the Jay Report 2022. The weaknesses of the Jay Report are that they only looked at 6 towns on the child grooming gangs, and they were sample towns, some towns where there wasn't any evidence of it. So there's at least 44 other towns, according to the reporting by Charlie Peters, who we heard earlier. He says there are 50 towns where he's seen evidence in court.
Yeah. So actually, I would say it's almost a little bit worse than that. Actually, so there were 6 towns that were looked at
by Jay,
but they were, and quite rightly, but this report did not specifically focus on gang-related rape gang grooming, child sexual exploitation.
Yes.
It looked at much wider things. The 6 towns that were chosen were specifically chosen around child sexual exploitation that had different complexities beyond.
So there was a degree of exploitation.
It wasn't 6 of the 50 that had been identified, because one was Warwickshire, one was St Helens, one was Durham, one was Bristol, one was Tower Hamlets.
So there were issues there, were there?
On other child abuse and child sexual exploitation, but not necessarily gang-related grooming. Right. So where Charlie Peters has done an excellent piece of work is he's effectively identified 50 towns where these issues around gang rapes, gang grooming has taken place that specifically need to be explored. I've been calling out about Bradford and Keighley, and that's why I am advocating to have that national inquiry that then, providing that it does specifically focus on those local areas. Because then, if you have local councils like Bradford that are refusing those requests, the government has that duty to step in, and that's where our Prime Minister is falling completely short on.
We think there are at least 50 towns affected by this. Do you think it's more than that?
I would not be surprised. And the reason, and I've also...
How many more than 50? 70? What do you think?
I don't know, but I would not be surprised. And that is why we need that national inquiry. I've said in the House of Commons chamber a few times now that I am absolutely, as others are concerned about, that the scale of the issue in the Bradford district will dwarf that of Rotherham, Rochdale, Oldham, Telford. And that's why we need that inquiry. And I do not understand for the life of me why people in positions of responsibility are denying my request and the request of victims, those families and survivors.
Jay Report came out on the same day as Liz Truss quit as Prime Minister. So I think that part of it, is this: we haven't had the conversation we had to have about the Jay Report, really. at the same time. I mean, there's no excuse. I think it's a failure, frankly, of journalism too. I think that people like Charlie Peters and others have done the work, but I think a lot of journalists, and myself included, haven't wanted to get into this. It's such a knotty area, a difficult area. It's race, children, faith groups. It's hard to talk about, and it's easier to talk about other things, isn't it, in politics? That's part of the problem you're facing.
Well,
it's a challenging topic, a really challenging topic.
It's a challenging topic, but actually, what do we get involved in politics for? It's not. It shouldn't be to chase votes.
Well, exactly.
It shouldn't be to protect our vote base. It should be about doing the right thing. And that's why I feel that there are too many people in positions of responsibility that have shied away from shining a spotlight.
There's a video online, isn't there, of you making your German debate back in 2021, a single Labour MP on the benches opposite.
Yeah. Disgraceful. Sarah Champion was the single MP that turned up, who I have an incredibly good working relationship with, and would hope she would consider me as a friend as I do her. Yeah. She has talked about this issue consistently for a number of times and been critical of those in a positions of responsibility. I have tried to continue the work that Anne Cryer did in my constituency, but there are not enough of us as individual MPs until now that have shown an interest in this, and that is a failure of duty and responsibility on all of us.
For listeners and viewers, why won't the PM order an inquiry? Is it because he's worried about where it might take? A judge doing an inquiry can go anywhere, look at emails, WhatsApps, text messages within the DPP, you might imagine, or his office, the CPS, the police. I mean, he maintains he did well in terms of ordering the first inquiry when it happened in 2012. The first in prosecution. He was on the front foot by his own account. That could be challenged by an inquiry. We don't know. Why is this government not wanting to do a public inquiry, and why didn't yours in 14 years?
Well, the Prime Minister is in a position that he could implement this national inquiry.
Why didn't any of your Prime Ministers do it?
If I'm being very honest, I'm as equally frustrated. This is something that I've been calling out, and and the Conservative government should have done this. I've never shied away from saying that. That's why I'm saying that the British state, in the widest perspective, had failed. But the point being here is the government is in a position to do something, and they're failing to do that. They're pushing the book back down to local councils to bring that forward, effectively asking them to mark their own homework.
Which your government did too, in other cases, not in your seat.
No, but that again is a failure.
It's a state issue.
Is a state failure of duty, which is the point that I've been trying to make.
So are they bringing race relations ahead of the victims here? Is that what you think has happened? Is that why there's a nervousness about it, because it's so difficult to talk about?
Well, certainly, I think that other MPs have experienced this in the past, where if you're calling the issue out for what it is, there has been MPs have been called racist, they've been called all sorts of things because they've been actually saying what has been going on, and that is unfortunate, and it is incredibly frustrating. Therefore, that those who are in a position of responsibility have not done the right thing. We need a national inquiry. It needs to have that specific local focus on the likes of Bradford and elsewhere. All of the recommendations in the Jay report, in my view, should be implemented. Some of them are very easy to do.
The government said they'll do that, haven't they? But no deadline on it.
Well, I mean, one of the recommendations is having a cabinet-level minister that sits around the cabinet that is in charge, that has full responsibility for children. Keir Starmer, if he wanted to, could do that right now. He could have done it on day one.
Is it disappointing that your leader, Kemi Badenoch, hasn't met any victims yet?
Well, I hope she does, and
she hasn't yet.
And Kemi's very welcome to come up to Keighley and to elsewhere. The victims, I'm sure, would want to interact with. When I was with Kemi,
quizzing the PM about this on Monday this week, he called it a far right issue. Is it a far right issue? Is talking about it emboldening the far right?
Well, this is a real frustration, because it's absolutely not, and I really take issue with the fact of the Prime Minister using the word far right, and also other people jumping on the bandwagon. That's
what he said about the Tories jumping on the bandwagon.
But this shows what the Prime Minister is trying to do here. He's not trying to address the core issue, which is the issue of what has happened to victims, to those survivors, and trying to seek justice. A national inquiry, what I would like to see, would lead to convictions of those perpetrators, but also those that have either swept this issue under the carpet.
And maybe guidance across police forces, and maybe guidance for prosecutorial advice across across prosecuting officers.
But absolutely, and anyone who has had safeguarding responsibility and not carried that out in full. But the narrative that the Prime Minister has been utilising in terms of referring to those jumping on the bandwagon or far right is then making those in the media, for example,
nervous about it.
And absolutely talk more about that issue.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many questions I've had over the last few days that has been more about who said what, when they said what, and how many times did they say it, rather than it being about the victims.
Let's just briefly talk about Jess Phillips. She's the safeguarding minister. Elon Musk has said some really bad things about her on Twitter. She's now got some protection. She's obviously correctly, Keir Starmer's backing her. Is that what do you make of all this? I mean, is it about too much about Jess Phillips? Or we said, the victims are the children. I mean, no one else is a victim here, right? So where do you sit with this? Or do you feel sorry for Jess Phillips?
Look, I think that the wording that Elon Musk has used and others on Twitter against our safeguarding minister is completely and wholly irresponsible,
yes.
And I can absolutely condemn those comments. It's wrong if a safeguarding minister, or indeed any minister, is exposed to risk. Crikey, I remember having armed police in my house, in my constituency, at 3 o'clock in the morning because I had risk to life that was immediately against me, and there had to be
because of what your work on these gangs.
I suspect it was linked to that, as well as other issues and other challenges we have in the constituency.
Too?
Absolutely, but the point being,
yes.
I'm not. But
no,
the point being
you,
here,
but
the point being here is the professional decision that the safeguarding minister had made in terms of not offering Oldham the opportunity of having national intervention, which is what Oldham Council were requesting, was the wrong professional decision, in my view, for the safeguarding minister to have made. Oldham are fortunate in a position in that their council are wanting something to be done about it. I have still got the battle in my area that the council, Bradford Council, don't want any more inquiry or an inquiry to take place, or any more spotlight to be shone on this issue. That is why the professional decision and conclusion that should be enacted by the government is for that national inquiry to take place, because that then puts, quite rightly, the victims back at the heart of this. They are the people that matter, making sure that they get the justice that they deserve, making sure that those perpetrators are criminally prosecuted, but also reinstalls trust back in the system, because victims feel disenfranchised by the state, and that is what is and that is where there is so much of a problem associated with this.
100%. And just finally, has Elon Musk helped? I mean, his aggressive tweeting has pushed it forward, hasn't it? Has woken up the establishment here about it. So has that helped? I mean, the way he's done it is controversial, at least what he said about Jess Phillips.
Yeah, and I feel the way in which Elon Musk and others have the wording that they've used has been completely and wholly inappropriate.
Yes.
And condemn it, as I have already said. But the fact that we are having a national conversation about this now, the fact that all MPs seem to be getting correspondence on this issue, hopefully from their constituents. The fact that we are now had a vote on this issue yesterday, and held those MPs that did not vote for a national rape gangs inquiry's feet to the fire, and that they will then have to justify their vote, is a good thing in terms of bringing focus on this issue. What needs to happen now, and I urge the Prime Minister to do the right thing, and all Labour politicians to do the right thing, is to enact the full recommendations of the ICSA report. But alongside that, this shouldn't be an either-or issue. Alongside that, have the full inquiry into rape gangs, into those 50 or so plus towns, like the Bradford district, so we can get proper justice brought to those to those victims, and trust reinstalled back in the system.
Robbie Moore, the MP for Keighley and Ilkley, thank you for joining us today on Chopper's Political Podcast. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So thank you again to Charlie Peters earlier, and thank you to you for listening and watching this wherever you are. A really important issue, I think you'll agree. I tweet at Christopher Hope on X. What's your Twitter handle, Robbie Moore?
It's _Robbie Moore.
There we are. If you want to get hold of Robbie, that's how you find what he's doing. Email me, chopper@gbnews.uk. If you found this podcast informative, please do tell your friends, and please leave a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. That helps other people to find it. Thanks to the great team of GB News colleagues behind the podcast. podcast. Mick Booker and Jeff Marsh back at headquarters. Rebecca Nunes and George McMillan here in Westminster. And most importantly of all, thank you to you for listening and watching wherever you are, and keep doing so. If you want more Chopper in your life, and who doesn't, catch me during the week on GB News with regular political updates and analysis. And keep up to date with our best reporting on our website, as I say, gbnews.com. Until next time though, cheerio.